No, the borders are inside your country. And if you're against, for example, someone telling you to mask up or to all this sort of policing and biopolitical policing that was introduced in COVID, then you have to be against, even more so against these immigration controls, because it leads to even more draconian forms of policing in the daily life of society.
I'm not sure that follows, actually, because somebody who's an illegal immigrant is not part of the political community. So the political community has the right to say, well, we either accept you temporarily or we don't. And I think there is a difference between that and saying the masking or vaccine
But
or
that
whatever.
form of like, we're going to harshly police outsiders and insiders will be free to do what they want to do, always leads to a more restrictive climate and repressive policies against those insiders. I think that's also a fantasy.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga.
We've been the Global Politics Podcast at the end of history since the very beginning, since 2017 when we kicked off this podcast. Everyone now agrees that the end of history is over. We don't have to convince people of that anymore. You even have people talking about the return of history, the rebirth of history, lots of big events happening, tectonic plates shifting, and we're here to discuss all of them over the course of not just this episode, but over the course of the year. I'm going to tell you what's coming up. I'm Alex Hochuli in Sao Paulo, Brazil, joined by George Hoare in London. Hello, George.
I'm still here. I've been here, still here.
And enthusiastically, Ryan Zickgraf, contributing editor in Pennsylvania. How's it going, Ryan?
Good afternoon, sirs.
Very good. So let me tell you, listener, what's going to happen here in this very episode. Got some announcements about what's coming up, not just over the course of the next month, but over the course of the next year, and what our priorities are before we move on to the main course of today, which is, I guess, what people are calling the Winter of Ice. We're going to be talking about what's going on in Minnesota, about the role of immigration policing in the US, how it's structured, why it's come to the forefront, what Trump's aims are, what the protesters are saying. Ryan has recently come back from Minnesota, so he'll be able to give us some on-the-ground accounts of what it's like there and how it relates to policing to the militarization of society and more beyond that. And then the final chunk of this episode is going to be us talking about your questions and comments that we've received over the past month and a half. In fact, we have a bit of a backlog. So we have a whole bunch of stuff, including answering questions about why we haven't been doing the big issues of this month so far, because a lot of stuff has happened. Venezuela, Greenland, Minnesota, to cite mere three things, and we'll explain to you what we've got coming up on that. We've got various discussions about, in response to Branko Milanovic's episode about the managers and the owners of capital, stuff about the pre-political and its relationship to the political, the notion of being a post-doomer, what that is and how that relates to the disintegrating conditions of society today. Anyway, big stuff. To get started, let me just tell you what we have identified as this podcast's central questions and central thematic priorities for the year, because this is not just us kind of throwing these out there, but it's a way that we seek to organize and prioritize the sort of episodes we do. And also this forms a guiding thread in the reading club. And we're going to announce what is coming up in the reading club over the course of the year in due course, but we can already tell you what's coming up for the first one or two that are happening in the next month. So if you want to join us for that, we always want your input, want your enthusiastic comments and questions. So what we're doing this year for that, let me just tell you that now. We're refocusing, I guess, on doing academic articles, perhaps, which there's something to draw from and bring to greater public appreciation and concern. We have maybe some sections from books, but really often focusing on classic essays, maybe from people who are dead, who we can't bring on and ask them the questions we would like to ask them. So instead, we're going to talk behind their back, behind their dead backs, and digest what they have taught us. and or indeed some things which might be in another language where the author isn't in a position to be interviewed in English about that. So these are the types of things we're going to try to pull out in the reading club, pieces which are kind of digestible and we can get our teeth into. So that's what we're approaching this reading club. Again, if you'd like to join, that's for the kind of highest tier of subscribers. If you go to patreon.com/bungacast/membership, you can find all that information there, and we hope you will join us for it. So anyway, what are we focusing on this year? And indeed, these themes may run well beyond 2026, but state capitalism. You may have heard a recent episode that we did specifically on that, and I think that sets out a lot of the criteria and parameters of what we're looking at. But state capitalism is the coming form of contemporary capitalism, and we're going to be exploring that around the world and what sort of institutions it's generating, what the next crisis will look like, and what will be its attempted resolution. We're going to continue discussing the pre-political. We've done several episodes on this recently, but what is the relationship between the pre-political and the political? How and what are the bases on which politics will be and could be rebuilt? We have militarism and war. I think that one's fairly self-explanatory, but we want to look at how dangerous the contemporary international disorder actually is. Another kind of more ideological, philosophical theme is irrationalism and unfreedom, what the primary forms of counter-enlightenment thought are today, what are emerging elite forms, or rather elite justifications for unfreedom and domination. And then finally, political recombination, which is probably the theme which would be most familiar to long-term listeners of this podcast, and indeed maybe to ourselves. What are the revolts against the established order today? What's going on? What sort of ideologies or recombinant ideologies are being thrown up? And what are the impediments to the emergence of a social majority for change today? So those are the kind of 5 big themes that we're looking at. You can read more about this in the newsletter, which is out around the time that this episode is released, maybe slightly afterwards. And so kind of discuss a little bit more and justify why we're looking at those things over 2026. Because I think we, especially with the Trump 2 administration in full swing, have been completed a year, I think we're really in quite different terrain to what we were in the first years of this podcast before the pandemic, and indeed even in the kind of immediate post-pandemic period. So I think there's some very serious questions and reorientations of thematic priorities that we have to do on this podcast, and we have already started doing and will continue doing. So this will be reflected in what I tell you is coming up next month over the course of, February and a little bit into March, perhaps. Firstly, we have a reading club on illiberalism. This is a kind of conceptual introduction to illiberalism, which is really a thin ideology. It's not a kind of thick programmatic thing, a thin ideology which exists in permanent situational relationship to illiberalism. This is the emerging post-liberal world. So we're going to be discussing that.
Just to interrupt, a permanent situational relationship, is that a situationship? This is what all the kids are talking about?
Yeah, but I think it's kind of like a marriage, but where they hate each other. Right, where the 2 members of the couple hate each other, so it's much more than a situation.
So marriage.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's the kind of boomer humor that we're trying to cultivate here, us millennials.
Yes, so this is aside from those 5 themes, we're also heavily leaning into boomer humor. So, check that out.
Yeah,
I mean, I think I've been criticized for that previously, so whatever.
Yeah. Well, we're not gonna take criticism on that matter. We have Jean-François Drolet coming on to talk to us about international relations and the revolutionary geopolitics of the new right, helping us situate Trump's coveting of Greenland in the context of both neoconservative and paleoconservative thought and the tensions between them. We're also going to be talking about Latin America and U.S.-Latin American relations. Juan Rojas is going to tell us about Venezuela, about Cuba. Lee Jones is going to present his interpretation and analysis of Trump's national security strategy. All this in the context of the new Monroe Doctrine, or the Dunroe Doctrine, as they're calling it. And I'm not sure that's a good name, but maybe we will cast judgment on that in that episode. We also have Alex Gurevich talking to Paul Gomberg. Paul Gomberg is the author of a book called Anti-Racism as Communism. In his work in general, he develops Marxist arguments for why racism can't be eradicated without overcoming capitalism, why kind of maybe racism is resurging today, and the limits of many contemporary anti-racist arguments. We've also got Ran Heilbrunn coming on talking about the abolition of queer theory and the problems of queer theories in terms of its failure to account for sex and sex within homosexuality, which I'm intrigued to listen to. And we'll have more on the postmodern nature of conservatism, which I think is in some ways a bit of a coherent theme throughout all that we've got coming up in February. Okay, that's enough announcements, and I've talked a little bit too much. Let's do ICE. Ryan, maybe if you would oblige us and give us for us and for listeners who aren't in the US, maybe haven't been following these things so closely, what has happened since the 6th of January, which is when the government sent in some 2,000 ICE removal and enforcement troops to Minnesota?
So, yeah, Department of Homeland Security, they talk about this as the largest immigration enforcement operation of all time. And they send it into the Twin Cities, the capital cities of Minneapolis, or I'm sorry, Minnesota. And part of the idea of it is, it's in reaction to, so there was a right-wing influencer / journalist who went to Minneapolis to uncover welfare fraud, which is something that mainstream outlets news outlets had reported on in the past. But this right-wing provocateur thought it was like a novel thing and went to childcare facilities that were often run by Somalis. And it became this big controversy because he said he uncovered a bunch of fraud. And so Trump used that as a sort of entry point into expanding this ICE operation in Minneapolis. Already, last fall, Trump first started sending these limited incursions into blue cities. And this is something that he talked about during the 2024 campaign. That was that, he was going to send feds to clean up the liberal cities. And so he went into DC and LA and Chicago, and that ramped up in the fall after the killing of Charlie Kirk. That was sort of a moment, I think that was in September. Trump said, the radical left is out of control and we need to go into these cities and really clean them up. So, so this really expanded. And then what really, as far as targeting Minneapolis, was this fraud report that this right-wing provocateur did. The citizen journalist went to childcare facilities all over Minneapolis and claimed to have found some new fraud. Turns out that a lot of that had been not only reported but prosecuted by Minnesota authorities, because a lot of it was pandemic related. But Trump took that as precursor to send 2,000 feds into Minneapolis. And already Minneapolis was a target for Trump because it's very liberal and progressive. One of his most hated Congress people, Ilhan Omar, is from there. And so he talked about, we need to deport the Somalis. I mean, the problem is in Minnesota is that 90% of the Somalis are actually citizens. But that was sort of his way into making this expansive operation in Minneapolis. So what these officers did was they were increasingly going into apartments, going into places like Target, like retail stores, and trying to find immigrants. Now, some of them were immigrants that had criminal history, but increasingly they did not. They were just undocumented. And yeah, they were making a ton of arrests. There's been sort of an arrest and deportation quota. So these ICE officers and Border Patrol were all over the place, detaining and arresting just about everybody they could find. And then what happened earlier in January is a U.S. citizen, Renee Good, who was part of this operation. There's been sort of a counterinsurgency, so to speak, of anti-ICE protesters, and what they've been doing is sort of coordinating. They've been tracking ICE from their federal building and following them, and then once they get out of their cars, they've been blowing whistles and trying to alert people of what's going on. Well, increasingly, the ICE and Border Patrol have been targeting protesters. And what Renee Good was somebody that was part of this operation, and she was trying to she was driving away, and then she was shot and killed. And so tensions escalated from there. And then, the raids intensified. I went to Minneapolis a couple days after the Renee Good shooting. And yeah, it felt like South Minneapolis, which is interesting because it's also where the George Floyd incident happened, once again became sort of the epicenter. And it was very, very tense while I was there.
Yeah, can you give us a sense of what you found there? Because I mean, again, I think the fact of it being, it only occurred to me afterwards. I mean, that it was the same place of the George Floyd killing, and how that whole thing plays out. Give us a sense of maybe what those neighborhoods are like. I've never been to Minneapolis. I don't really have much of a sense of it either.
Yeah, Minneapolis is, I would say, like a mid-sized city. And when I was there, I mean, it is a cold city, especially right now. We've had a little bit more of a harsher winter here in Northern America. And when I was there, downtown was very dead. There's a lot of people, like visitors and people that would normally come into Minneapolis, but they're scared off. Like the hotel I was staying at downtown, the people behind the desk were fielding calls like, is ICE right there? Is the National Guard there? And so downtown is pretty dead. There's an area of South Minneapolis that is very residential, sort of I'd say an old artistic middle-class neighborhood. There's like art museums, very, very diverse though. That area is where George Floyd was killed, and a lot of that initial protests and occupation was going on in 2020. And even, you can walk there from the site where Renee Good was shot, and it still has that feel. It still has that remnants of 2020 there. It almost feels like walking around that neighborhood, you kind of feel like you're in a museum, I'd say of the 2020s, because there's so much that went on there. From there, there was a mass shooting there at a church, I think in 21, 22. There was a labor strike there. And so you get a sense talking to a lot of the residents that their neighborhood just hasn't felt calm. It hasn't felt normal in the last 5 years. So this, in a way, like, it's definitely an escalation, but everybody sort of had felt unsettled already. So it's kind of like, oh, this again?
I mean, it seems like a lot of the rhetoric, I mean, both from kind of liberal and conservative sides are, they were asking for it in a certain way. Or, like that, the sense that on the one hand, it might be that the Trump administration is trying to provoke these reactions and accusations that on the other hand, from the conservative side going, well, or, especially in like MAGA world of going like, well, this is something which people are trying to get in the way. They're putting themselves in harm's way deliberately as a way of provoking. So in a way, they're kind of both sides are accusing each other of provocation, of having initiated, of trying to, create into being this sort of kind of warlike conditions on the street. And I don't know how you read that, or who started it. I don't know if I want to ask you that, but I don't know if you have a read on how this kind of has emerged and kind of where culpability kind of lies.
Well, let's keep in mind, because 2,000 federal agents is sort of an abstract number. Minneapolis police has a total of about 600 regular city police officers. So they themselves were completely outnumbered, and that's a lot for a city of, you're talking about in the middle of the city of, just a couple 100,000 people. And these agents were not acting like regular police. I mean, I witnessed for myself, and I've been to a lot of protests over the last decade. And what I'd never seen before was the way that in Minneapolis, these feds were attacking protesters for things that would not have been attacked for before. I was with some protesters outside this federal building again, where ICE agents were sort of going back and forth, and they were taking people into custody. And they were across the street. There was literally there was a fenced off federal building, and then a street, and then the protesters were on the other side of the street. And every couple hours, this sort of line would form among federal agents, and then they would do I don't know, a charge that seemed like something from the Civil War, where they line up and all of a sudden, you charge with the bayonets. They would charge this group of protesters that, were just mostly just ordinary, concerned liberals. A lot of elderly people, people that were retired that, were interested in just protesting. They had their signs like you would. I mean, the right, the DHS and the Trump administration was painting them as these professional paid protesters, these domestic terrorists. But what I found is a lot of them were just concerned citizens, some of them who had never actually protested before. In my piece, I talk about this woman who have never protested before. She came in this ski suit. She had these big goggles. And I watched as federal agents tackled her. They charged her across the street. She played roller derby, so she was not an easy target. So they just swarmed her and knocked her to the ground. And it was shocking to see. So it's hard not to see a lot of this federal. It's hard not to see the feds as sort of the instigator here. It's hard to buy this idea that it's Minneapolis's fault for instigating. Now, are the Trump administration, is this operation a little bit about trying to stir up more agitation and to escalate, to try to make it more like what the protests look like in 2020 to justify more enforcement? I think that's true, but for the most part, I think the protesters aren't playing that game.
Well, I mean, yeah, I've even read suggestion that ICE is trying to, at some point, get one of its officers killed as a way of portraying themselves as the victim of all this, and I mean, those are well-worn strategies of repression in various places in the world. So it's not exactly something kind of unthinkable. But I guess
and one thing I was going to add, it was that I think a lot of the protesters are aware of that, and so they're reminding each other not to cross the line, not to be violent. There was a guy I saw that was kicking ICE cars as they were driving by. Now, obviously, kicking a car, you're not actually doing much damage, but it was something that they were trying to self-police, right? To try not to provoke that kind of reaction.
Right.
So the Alex Pretti incident happened, I believe it was January 24th. He was a protester. He was actually like an ICU nurse. He was there protesting. And what he was doing was, there was a woman that was pushed down, and he was trying to help up, and there was a bit of a scuffle between them and the ICE agents. And so multiple agents had him on the ground. One found a gun on him, which he was, Minnesota has a concealed carry law, which means that if you have the right documents and application, you can carry a gun. And so they found a gun on him. And then I believe I read, I think today, that multiple officers shot him in the back while he was on the ground. And yeah, it sparked, like, the January 7th, Renee Good was the first sort of martyr, and Alex Pretti was the second.
I mean, it's quite shocking, like and shocking, not just in its own right, as it obviously is, but the U.S. is a very violent place. The forces of repression have often been violent, but against the right, the allowed targets. Right. There's always been the homo sacer, the person you can kill with impunity, and often that's been Black Americans, or maybe it's someone who's like a vagrant, a homeless, whatever. Someone who's very much an outsider to society, true subaltern. But American society has in large part held together through the 19th, especially the 20th centuries, often because it has sought to include white middle class people and not subject them to this sort of repression. And here, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm not abreast enough of the U.S. history, particularly as it regards this matter, but this seems to be a real sort of step change in the brutality of policing, the militarization of policing, and its willingness to kind of kill someone willy-nilly. I mean, I know we were discussing yesterday, kind of chatting about this, but it seems to me the first time that something like this has happened since the Kent State killings in the 1960s, and then you mentioned maybe the Democratic Convention in Chicago of 1968. Those were maybe the last moments where you had that sort of repression of the insiders, of American society.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back earlier in American history, in the 19th century, there was violent repression against parts of the labor movement, or like labor riots and strikes. There was like a big nationwide thing in 1877 where there was a lot of railroad strikes, where the president at the time authorized the National Guard to come in, and they were shooting strikers in Chicago and St. Louis and other cities. But in the 20th century, as you mentioned, yeah, I think it was more during the civil rights movement and some of the unrest during the 60s. But for our lifetimes, we haven't really seen like anything like this. And it does, I think Trump at a certain point last year was explicit in saying, that he was going to otherize radical liberals, right? And to include a certain set of liberals into this group that was sort of, not real Americans, not someone that has full rights, not American rights, not really American. And with Minneapolis, that's been made clear.
Yeah, no, it's like reducing the boundaries of citizenship is quite, it really is quite shocking, but perhaps not that unexpected. And I mean, that's always been a contradiction within American society. But again, if the rope that you kind of circle around those who are kind of insiders and who are subaltern, if that relationship changes drastically and citizenship is reduced, then that changes matters quite significantly. But it also seems to create contradictions for the administration, which it has to deal with. So one of the most interesting things to come out of this has been, and like the past couple of days, from what I can tell, is that the slaying of Alex Pretti has serious implications for the Second Amendment, let alone the First and the Fourth. So as you mentioned, he has the right to concealed carry. And this is basically the federal government saying, your right to bear arms is entirely conditional and actually may be killed for it, which surely provokes and angers the pro-gun section of society. And I wonder if you have a sense of like how far that's actually gone, and whether this has been, really problematic and divisive within MAGA world, let alone outside of it.
Yeah, I mean, the state of partisanship in America, both sides are rife with contradictions, and that part is nothing new, but the sort of blatantness of the Pretti killing and the fact that, we had a high profile shooting during 2020 during George Floyd. There's a young 20-something named Kyle Rittenhouse who shot protesters during the George Floyd, and MAGA defended him, and he was eventually a judge let him off for killing these protesters. And what he did was he was allowed to carry a weapon, and he did it during a protest. And so yeah, the MAGA invoked the Second Amendment constantly during that point. Now, seemingly a similar situation where a guy brought a concealed weapon, although unlike Kyle Rittenhouse did not brandish it and shoot somebody. He was simply had it on his person while he was engaged in, First Amendment activities. The fact that, a lot of the knee-jerk right-wing response was, well, he shouldn't have brought a gun to a protest, right? But there is that sort of pure libertarian impulse, though, by some. I think there's this divide where some people are like, well, he was within his constitutional rights. And when we have this authoritarian police telling us, you're not allowed to carry a gun when we don't like your politics, is a bridge too far, I think, from some of the right wing, including a MAGA Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was a congresswoman here. She resigned recently, but she was hyper MAGA, and in fact, she was used to be known for talking about conspiracies about Jewish space lasers and whatnot. She's been pushing back, saying that that Pretti was right to carry, and that MAGA has to watch out because they're being incited into civil war. So there has been some pushback even within the right, and so I think that's part of the reason why Trump is all of a sudden started to backpedal a little bit and fired Greg Bovino, who was sort of the cowboy-like commander of this operation.
Yeah, and I want to come on to that in a second, but yeah, I think it's interesting in all this how whether this is there'll be a degree of overreach on the part of the administration, because it does seem to be able to, because it's a coalition of kind of various different groups, not so organized, that someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, once she gets kind of, she resigned, but she also kind of got the push from Trump, and Trump turned on her, that there's something kind of combustible within the whole MAGA drive that can turn against Trump himself, or the administration as it is, or different tendencies within it. And we've talked about this in the podcast before, and we're going to be talking quite a lot about it over the coming month as well, between neocons and paleocons and kind of nationalists and the tech sector. And, these things can be brought to the fore in moments of crisis like this. I wonder, it seems to me that what's happening now in Minnesota, and I want to just make this point, or at least test this out, and maybe Ryan, you can correct me, but it seems quite different from the summer of 2020 and over George Floyd, because although there's a temptation to say, well, look, both were, from a liberal perspective, these were both great moments of anti-racist struggle. People came out onto the streets and fought the fascist cops. And from the right-wing perspective, to go, this is both moments of liberal craziness and interfering with law enforcement and making themselves a spectacle and all the rest of it. And I think we should probably distinguish those moments, because 2020 was a particularly weird time, as we discussed recently in our discussions of Eddington, which captures that weirdness very well. It was people came out. Obviously, it was a moment of an outrageous injustice in terms of the killing of George Floyd. But then a lot of stuff spun off the back of that, a desire to simply get outside and do something during the pandemic and the lockdowns, maybe. But also, the amount of arson and bizarre spectacles such as the Chaz in Seattle and all this sort of stuff did seem to be, for all that you might point the finger at the authorities for starting it and for their repression, there's a lot of weird liberal shit that went on then, and this seems to be a pretty different case as far as I read it. And to me, the kind of right wing finger pointing at liberals in this case seems to be completely wide of the mark. All the arguments around ICE acting in self-defense against Renee Good, for example, seem to me utterly bizarre and baseless, and really, I think, ultimately rely on a kind of basis of cruelty, which is really quite shocking, I guess, in its baselessness and its kind of transparent attempt to provide cover for what the administration and what its kind of amped up forces of repression are actually doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in 2020 in Minneapolis, there was a lot of there was widespread fires, there was looting, there was businesses that were broken into, and still 5 or 6 years later, some of those areas haven't fully recovered, and so there was an aspect of law enforcement actually trying to protect people that live there and their businesses and their homes. In fact, one of the people that I interviewed while I was in Minneapolis here a couple weeks ago was someone who actually lived in that area and had to throw water on his log pile in his yard to keep people from burning it, because that was happening all over. And it's almost now with this ICE operation, and that they act like that what's going on there is George Floyd redo, that it is the same conditions, but it's not. I mean, hardly anyone among the protesters are actually breaking the law, but the way that the administration and ICE agents are acting is as if they are. So I just think that a lot of people, even Republicans, are seeing through the bullshit.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So I wanted to, actually, let me just ask you, Ryan, to just give us a little bit of the backstory, because I wasn't aware of this, about the role of sanctuary cities and dumping, because that's a little bit of the political history behind this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, ICE has been around since Bush won in a few years after 9/11. And it's sort of grown slowly. And then during Trump won, he expanded it. But it's been something that, during Obama, he was supposedly the deporter of chief. I think Trump is correct that there was increased illegal immigration during the Biden administration. And so Trump campaigned a lot on sort of a deportation state. And in his first term, he was wanting to build a wall. He always said that he was going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. Eventually, the wall got built. Mexico did not pay for it. But as immigration became like a bigger deal, there was some governors in states, on border states like Texas, Greg Abbott, and in Florida, where normally there was, like in Texas, there is a lot of immigration from Mexico or Central America that flowed from there, and that they claimed that a lot of these northern cities and states weren't really aware. They were just virtue signaling about sort of open borders and free immigration. So they had this sort of a maniacal idea to spread the pain around. So what governors like Greg Abbott did was, these immigrants from Venezuela or Mexico, whatever, they would put them in buses or planes and then fly them to so-called sanctuary cities, where these cities that, like New York City and Chicago, that said that, everyone's welcome, and they were going to not cooperate with federal authorities on enforcing certain types of immigration operations. So yeah, these governors would just export them. They would just drop them off. They would give them one-way bus tickets to these cities. And while it was a shitty thing to do, that these immigrants were pawns in sort of this political game. It did, the one thing it did do was it created tensions in these cities. Like, I know that these mayors and these governors wanted to put their money where their mouth was, literally. So they they would put these immigrants in hotels, and they would spend millions of dollars, and then in some cases building tent cities. And so a lot of resources were directed to these immigrants, and it created some political tensions. You had working class residents of some of these blue cities saying, like, I'm not getting much of a hand up, but yet you're devoting all of these resources to immigrants. So there was some political blowback to that.
I guess I had a couple of thoughts or questions on kind of what this all means, because you kind of alluded or mentioned earlier, there's this potential split within the MAGA base between those very prepared to defend particularly the Second Amendment and those maybe not so concerned with it. But I mean, we sort of maybe have heard this before, that there's something that's going to split the MAGA base in two. The tariffs were supposed to potentially do this. It's maybe it's always been a contradictory alliance across different parts of society and different parts of the US. I mean, do you think that this is something which is going to really have those kind of long lasting political, I don't know, reverberations is the wrong word, but it seems like what it could represent is a flashpoint in kind of the politics of immigration in the US, and that would be very significant given the US self-conception and reality, I guess, of being a nation of immigrants. But is it really about that, or is it about the militarization of social relations in more generally? The military coming in and doing policing. It seems like, I mean, because that's one thing it's difficult to assess from the outside. It's like, to what extent is this? I mean, it's it must be at least a relatively big news story that two citizens were murdered for no reason. But that happens in, not to be facetious, but that does happen in the US. It does happen. Mass shootings are not as rare as you might perhaps want them to be. So yeah, I guess that's my sort of just being a little bit skeptical, because it seems like there's, Alex opened this with a lot of talk about all this stuff that's going on, and we've got some listener questions on this, and I have what is probably going to be a very unpopular take on all of this stuff. But is this a kind of feeding itself into this feeling of crisis and collapse, whereas in fact it's a fairly predictable if terrible consequence of the development of the US state in terms of its kind of internal management of its citizens.
Well, there is a way in which I would say over the last few years, there was, we had the hashtag resistance during Trump won, right? And we had hyper politics sort of emerge in that time. And things did really calm down under the Biden administration as far as this political upheaval. And going into this administration, things were, I think, I've argued on this podcast before, were more subdued. But there's something about this operation in particular that is bringing back the sleeping beast of the liberal resistance, and people are really uniting and coming out and getting engaged with politics before that I haven't seen since 2020. For instance, I live in a mid-sized capital city that is far away from Minneapolis, but there's been I was walking to work the other day and there was an anti-ICE protest. Even though there's not much evidence that ICE has really spent much time here, there is a lot of nationwide protests happening in cities all over the country. Not only like liberal cities, but even suburbs, right? I think the way that in which this operation is played out, and the way that everyone could watch these videos of these citizens being shot, in the face or in the back by armed agents, I think that there's something visceral about the reaction to it, and it is really mobilized. I'm not going to say, some people are like, woke is back, woke 2.0, because of this. I don't know if I'd go that far, but there are I mean, in Minneapolis, there was sort of this civic pride. There was sort of like, it's funny because it's a liberal city, but there's like a don't tread on me attitude, you know,
Mm.
that you would expect more from the right, but it is getting people together. And I'm often skeptical of the whole like mutual aid, you know, community banding together, but I really did see that. And I see that there's places in America that are sort of like, you know, whether the ICE threat is real there or not, or sort of organizing or talking about organizing there. So I think this is a sort of a pivotal moment in history right now, and I don't exactly know where it's going to go. I feel like we're still in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that sounds like. I mean, look, and I'm far from far from wishing a revival of liberal resistance politics. But I mean, in fact, it's would seem to me that this would be a form of resistance, which would be at least, you know, it would put it this way, that it wouldn't be woke, right? I mean, at least that was understood from, you know, 2012 to 2022, if you want to date it, because it's not this kind of narcissistic censorious politics, but rather it seems more of a repeat of the form of like anti-George W. Bush politics of a conservative assault and liberal, perhaps maybe slightly helpless liberal resistance against it in the name of kind of liberal civil society against the state. And maybe we should take this opportunity to turn to looking at ICE and its structure and financing as a whole, because I mean, there's an interesting article in Phenomenal World, which I was just going to kind of try to summarize, I guess, a little bit, and then we can kind of comment on it, because I do think it's telling as to the like militarization of policing that it involves, and particularly this notion of the interiorization of the border. So ICE, and particularly in its guise as removals, and I've now forgotten the term. I'm like, what's it called?
Deportation?
Yeah, deportation, removal, something like that. I've forgotten the term now, but that, you know, that it's more
asking to leave, politely escorting out.
yeah. But that it's more tyrannical, that it's using facial recognition algorithms as well as the whims of street level agents to decide who's detained and deported. A lot of this stuff is old in terms of the militarization of of policing, dating back to the global war on terror. But under Trump too, some things have changed. So I'm going to quote here from the article: by reconfiguring lines of authority and warping agency functions, the administration is mounting an existential challenge to the existing terms of order that govern the rights of non-citizens, while turning citizenship itself into a more flexible category. This then involves an attempt to redefine criminality so as to implicate larger numbers of immigrants and activists, for example, by expanding the legal definition of terrorism to include various forms of political dissent, or by designating fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. And this is something we've talked about before, but the kind of this idea of narco-terrorism, it's like, yeah, okay, the war on drugs didn't, you know, happen and then didn't quite work. Then there was a war on terror, and then now that, like, in the wake of both those attempts at increasing state power, they've like latched onto this discourse of narco-terrorism, which is equally and probably more phony than the previous forms of legitimation that that accompanied those previous episodes from the 1980s through the past decade. What's actually happening, it seems, is like this is an attempt at the Trump administration to build state capacity, but really just in the state's repressive arm. And there's some astounding figures quoted in this article. So Trump's big, beautiful bill allocated $171 billion for immigration control, 46 billion to complete the border wall, 45 billion to expand immigration detention centers, 18 billion for border facilities and initiatives, and 30 billion on top of ICE's existing 10 billion base budget to bolster deportation and removal operations. ICE's annual budget increased threefold to around $28 billion through to 2029, making it the largest federal law enforcement agency in the country. All this means that the force is becoming increasingly militarized and high tech for sustained operations inside US cities, including against protesters. This is really surprising, but the proportion of ICE arrests has increased from 20% of the total detained to 82% relative to the Border Patrol. So whereas ICE is dedicated to the kind of internal policing of the border, in workplaces and schools and so on, you've got the Border Patrol really doing things at the border. So while the overall number detained has drastically increased, there's been a big shift towards these internal arrests versus detentions at the border. And all of this seems to me to be more evidence of this interiorization of the border, and which is the I think really is at the vanguard of the attack on freedom in the US. It seems to me.
What do you mean by interiorization of the border? Because I know this is from the article, and I know it's a phrase that gets used quite a bit, but I've always felt a little bit kind of like there's something I don't fully grasp about this idea. Because I mean, one thing which I think one wider question which I think this has raised is like what would an effective border control look like in a continental nation? Like there is a kind of democratic legitimacy behind being able to control the flow of people into your nation. I mean, this is something which I think is, should be defended. But of course, the way that it's been being executed in the US seems almost to be like one of the best ways to undermine that kind of stated aim.
Well, I think there's a kind of perhaps a bit of a fantasy behind some anti-immigration arguments, which is like, listen, just control people at the borders, but like we should be free within the boundaries of the nation. And to a certain degree, there will it's not just unless you're like on some small island or something, which can be easily, can easily repulse any entrance.
With living on an island.
I said a small island. I mean, we're talking about Tahiti can maybe police it. Well, it probably doesn't have the capacity to do that specifically. But anyway, the point being that it will always, because you're going to allow people to enter the country, whether they're tourists for working part-time or to visit or for, visit family, whatever it might be, unless you're going to be completely autarkic and not let anyone enter or exit your country, you're going to have flows in and out. And if you're going to have that, then but you want to restrict people from settling or from working in the country, then you're going to have to do internal policing. The border is not just something that happens out there next to, in the US at the Mexican border or in the Gulf of Mexico, but it's something that happens in institutions in civil society. So it means having cops of some sort, checking who's being employed, checking in schools, who's there, people reporting on one another. There's these forms of internal repression which necessarily come with it. And a certain degree of that might be tolerable, right? Someone gets arrested for a crime and then it turns out that they don't have papers. And then you go, well, you turn them into the immigration authorities. And I think most people would tolerate that or would find that perfectly acceptable even. But there's another degree to which, the kid comes to school and it turns out that he's undocumented and the whole family gets rounded up, and they use the kid then as bait to find other members of his family to also round them up, which is what's happening in the US right now. So I think a lot of the anti-immigration politics today rests on a fantasy. And that isn't to say that one therefore has to accept an open borders or no borders politics. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm in favor of a liberal immigration policy, but I accept that there need to be some degree of controls. And in particular, I'm very wary of the way in which the importation of a mass number of people is a way of driving down wages within a country and creating an underclass of exploitable people. I'm against that, but I'm also very aware that it isn't just this notion of like, well, just protect the borders, just build a wall, which is what I have always found to be especially infantile in that Trumpian demand, the build a wall, that it's like, oh, it's just an infrastructural issue. If you just build a big fucking wall, then we're safe and we don't have to worry about anything anymore. And it's like, no, the borders are inside your country.
Hello, friends. You've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/Bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the Bungacast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the Bungacast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/Bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.